Hi, it's Dwyer, gamblersadvisory.com. Remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Today is September 7th, 2012. Let's talk about a couple of things that are on my mind. First, according to reports, it looks like Manny Pacquiao is going to fight Juan Manuel Marquez for a fourth time. Understand what's at stake. Anything less than a convincing victory by Pacquiao is going to open the door to more uncertainty for Pacquiao going forward. In other words, it'll just validate the feeling among many that Juan Manuel Marquez has his number. Right? And if that's the feeling, and if the fight is a financial success, again, anything short of Pacquiao really dominating by several rounds to the point where even Nacho Beristain thinks that his fighter is lost, anything short of that is going to jeopardize any possibility of a Pacquiao-Mayweather fight. A fight that, ironically, I don't think takes place anyway. Let me also point out, too, that Manny Pacquiao has unfinished business with Timothy Bradley, right? We should all be aware of the fact that if Bradley continues to dominate in the ring, even against other competition, right, then the public is going to want to see that fight again. Let me go one step further. If Bradley dominates against other competition, let's remember, I'm talking about a multi-weight class champion who's still unbeaten, who on paper has a better record than Manny Pacquiao, right? If Timothy Bradley continues to dominate, then just like Josecito Lopez, by looking good against Victor Ortiz, got a shot against Saul Alvarez, you can imagine that Timothy Bradley will be viewed as a viable opponent for anyone who can't get a dance date with Manny Pacquiao. So keep a close eye on who Pacquiao fights next. Already you've had some fighters, Miguel Cotto, choose not to fight Pacquiao because Pacquiao wanted weight restrictions a few years ago. Opponents would have jumped at the weight restriction to fight Manny Pacquiao. Right now, the shine is a bit off Pacquiao's star because now fighters are going to Plan B. So, expect an announcement that Manny Pacquiao is going to fight Juan Manuel Marquez. I doubt he fights Timothy Bradley again. There are rumors that Manny Pacquiao has been in touch with Al Heyman, who is Floyd Mayweather's manager. Maybe there's some behind-the-scenes move that we don't know about. But do understand that these promotions take months to develop. And right now you have several big fights on the docket for later this year, including big fights that are scheduled to take place in December, like the Miguel Cotto Austin Trout fight. Right? I'm assuming that Manny wouldn't want to double book a date like Saul Alvarez has done on the Sergio Martinez, Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. date. All right, let's talk about some fights coming up this weekend. In fact, before I do that, let me just say, later today, we're going to have one of the more important weigh-ins in several months, and that's going to be the weigh-in of Chad Dawson for the Andre Ward fight. Now, reports are that Chad Dawson is going to make weight comfortably, right? But let's be careful. You don't want Dawson to make weight too comfortably. In other words, the weight limit's 168. Dawson, if he comes in at 167 or less, I would view that as a bad sign. I would view that as a light heavyweight having overtrained. This is one of those weigh-ins where Dawson should really be, in my opinion, within, let's say, 3/4 of a pound of 168. right? If he shows up and he looks too dehydrated and he's too far below weight, that's a problem. If he fails to make weight and has to run around the block a few times, or worse yet, hit the sauna to lose a couple of pounds, that's going to be an awful sign, because this is a very close fight, and he's fighting one of the sport's pound-for-pound greats in Andre Ward. So that weigh-in deserves all of our attention. Let's talk about some fights that do too. Marco Antonio Rubio is fighting Carlos Baldomir. Now let me just say this, right? Baldomir had one of boxing's best chins, but it's my belief that once your chin is dented conclusively, in other words, once you're on the canvas and it's not a flash knockout, in fact, you're unconscious on the canvas, then that's the kind of thing that stays with you. I've seen too many fighters go a long time without ever getting stopped. Then once they get stopped, suddenly they start to have problems, right? So Baldomir's chin, as legendary as it is, put question marks on it. Let me also point out that Rubio fought a bigger man who was a pressure fighter, who pressured him the entire fight, and yet he still went the distance. And that was Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., right? Forget the weights, the listed weights. Just keep in mind that Chavez Jr. gains 20 pounds after weigh-ins. So Rubio was really fighting a light heavyweight when he fought Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. And still, he was able to deal with the pressure. He was able to go the distance. He didn't win the fight, but he went the distance against a young, bigger lion, right? My point to you is Baldomir is a pressure fighter, much like Chavez Jr. And Baldomir is much older than Chavez Jr., and Baldomir is smaller than Chavez Jr., right? Let me say this too. Rubio is excellent with the jab. His jab is actually underrated, right? He's also excellent skill-wise. He can fight you outside, he can fight you inside, and he's very tough mentally. This is a guy who was fighting David Lemieux, then an unbeaten fighter, and he was able to weather a pretty tough opening couple of rounds, kept his head, didn't panic, was able to take out David Lemieux, right? When he fought Kelly Pavlik, people forget, Rubio has fought several tough fighters. When he fought Kelly Pavlik in Youngstown, he was able to make it into the later rounds. And this was not the current Kelly Pavlik, who's a little bit shop-worn and has had problems. This was Kelly Pavlik when he was younger and a bit more invincible, right? I believe that Marco Antonio Rubio wins this fight. I think that Carlos Baldomir, for all the big talk, and I know he's been talking big beforehand about knocking out Rubio, I think he's going to have a problem with Rubio's jab and length. Rubio really is quite skillful in operating behind a jab. He also has a very big punch. If Rubio can keep this fight in the middle of the ring, he should find a lot of success. I like Rubio in that fight. Let's go to Northern New Jersey. Tomas Adamek against Travis Walker. Now, I know this sounds crazy, but hey, let's just talk about what works. I found that when a fighter gets a gift, and keep in mind, he could actually have won the fight, but where the scorecards are a little bit wider than they should have been, that fighter gets penalized down the road by the judges. In other words, I know it shouldn't happen. I know experts are going to say I'm crazy. I know people on YouTube are going to say I'm crazy. But you show me a Felix Sturm against a Matthew Macklin, right? And all I can say, in fact, Felix Sturm against Martin Murray, all I can say is when word gets around that a fighter has gotten, let's say, some undeserved scoring, whether or not you think he's won the fight, right? When word gets around that a fighter has gotten some undeserved scoring, Oscar De La Hoya, Pernell Whitaker, then what happens, in my opinion, is that judges will punish that fighter later. And so, of course, after De La Hoya got a clear gift against Pernell Whitaker, Oscar De La Hoya lost to Shane Mosley. Not so much the first fight. I'll give Mosley the first fight. But that second fight, you got to be kidding me. Right? In fact, the Felix Trinidad fight. De La Hoya lost the Felix Trinidad fight. And I really get the feeling that, judges are human too. They look at a fighter, they say, hey, this guy has gotten breaks in the past. If that round is close and, it could go either way, I've just found that guys who get gifts get punished. Right? So Felix Sturm fights Daniel Geale, and you know the rest, even in Germany. And I thought it was the right decision, but even in Germany, the judges said, hey, no. There was an 8-round difference between the judge that had Sturm up by 4 rounds and the other 2 judges who had Geale up by 4 rounds. But all I'm saying is the folklore on the Eddie Chambers-Tomas Adamek fight is that Tomas Ademek's game slipped. Eddie Chambers had a hurt hand, couldn't even throw it after a couple of rounds. Tomas Adamek struggled in the fight, and I mean struggled in the fight, and then was awarded what some thought was some home cooking on the judges' scorecards. Right? All I'm saying is there is a lot of skepticism out there about Tomas Adamek. Now he's fighting Travis Walker. And understand, Travis Walker, and I know he famously got stopped by Chris Arreola after putting Arreola on the deck in a shootout. But there's another side to Travis Walker. That's the side that had him giving a very spirited match against one of my personal favorites, Ruslan Chagayev. Right? Walker has fought world-class competition. This is going to be nothing new for him. Now, the bet I'm recommending is the over 7.5 rounds at -230. In other words, this fight just has to make it past the halfway point of the 8th round, right? It's 7 full rounds and then half of the next round. It just has to make it past the halfway point of the 7th round for you to collect. Right? And I'm expecting a spirited match. In other words, Adamek as a heavyweight really fights better off his back foot. Right? He likes to dance around you. Think Adamek, Michael Grant. Right? He likes to move. In fact, think Adamek, Chris Arreola. And so what that means is that his fights are going to go a few rounds. Right? Adamek used to be the light heavyweight champ. Now he's fighting at heavyweight. He's not a big heavyweight. So I'm expecting him to be on his back foot, and I'm expecting this fight to go a few rounds. And if Adamek has lost any of his skills, and let's remember, he did get badly blown out by Vitaly Klitschko, the kind of beating that might stay with you. He hasn't looked like Tomas Adamek since that beating. If Tomas Adamek has slowed down even 1 iota, I believe that makes it more likely that this fight goes over 7.5 rounds. Let me point out, too, I'm going to hedge the play. Right? And the hedge is going to surprise some people. But Travis Walker to win the fight is a +400. If your casino is offering you a hedge of Travis Walker by KO, I can only imagine what those odds are. That'd be a lot higher. Here, since I know of the Walker +400 to win the fight, I believe you can take both the over 7.5 rounds at -230 and hedge it with Walker at +400. The difference between the minus 230 and the plus 400 gives you a hedging opportunity. You're not going to make a lot of money on this fight, but the key is simply to make money. Let me just point out that I expect Adamek to win the fight. The hedge on Walker is really just a numbers play. You're giving me a plus 400 on a fighter who I think is in a competitive fight. I'm looking for value. Sometimes in betting, I'm going to bet against the guy I think is going to win the fight if you give me enough value. So likewise, the Andre Ward-Chad Dawson fight. Dawson right now is a plus 250. That's ridiculous. I consider Dawson to be one of the top 5 fighters. In fact, one of the top 4 fighters, pound for pound, in the entire sport. And you're going to give me a plus 250. There again, even though I think Ward has a lot going for him. After all, the fight's in Ward's backyard, Oakland. The fight's at Ward's weight, 168. Right? Ward gets to train at his home gym with his people. Right? His trainer, everyone gets to live at home during training camp. John Scully and Chad Dawson had to leave Connecticut, had to travel. Right? So while Ward has a lot going for him, and while I do believe Bernard Hopkins, who fights a similar style to Ward, won at least 4 rounds against Chad Dawson. I thought Dawson won the fight, but I thought Hopkins won a few rounds. And while I think Ward is much younger and fresher, with more stamina than Hopkins, who, let's be honest, has to take a few rounds off in his late 40s, right? I do think Ward probably wins the fight. Probably. But my point to you is that fight is so close, it's so risky, that just like in the Walker fight there, I'm taking the underdog at plus 250. Hedged against the over. The over's really my base bet there. The over 9.5 rounds. And don't be fooled by lines on some of these websites. What I want you to do to get more accurate odds is to go to oddschecker.com. Okay, don't believe for a second that the over-under is 11.5 rounds, which some of these sites are listing. Go to oddschecker.com. They'll show you the, universe of sites, and you'll be able to see that many shops have this at 9.5 as an over-under. That's the Ward-Dawson fight. All right. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think. To sum up, I think Marco Antonio Rubio beats Carlos Baldomir. I like that play. In the Adamek Walker fight, the way I'm playing it is the over 7.5 rounds at minus 230, straddled against Travis Walker at plus 400, right? If Adamek has slipped, Travis Walker will find out early, right? So, it's the over 7.5 at minus 230, straddled against Walker at plus 400. As long as it goes over, if you organize the straddle correctly, you'll be okay. Right? If it doesn't go over, understand the risk. If it doesn't go over and Adamek gets an early knockout, you lose it all. Okay? And finally, Ward Dawson, just some last minute thoughts. Chad Dawson at plus 250. Look, even though I think Ward has maybe a 55% chance of winning the fight, I've got to take that plus 250. Straddle against the over 9.5 rounds. I don't see either guy knocking the other guy out early. Thanks for watching.